The morning air was crisp when Daniel walked through the heavy metal doors of the automotive workshop. He was always early, arriving at least 20 minutes before class started. Not because he was overly eager or trying to impress anyone. He just liked the quiet. Those few minutes before everyone else showed up gave him time to look around, to really see the engines and tools without feeling like someone was watching his every move. And people did watch. Daniel had gotten used to it by now, but that didn't make it any easier. Being one of only 3 black students in the entire automotive program meant he stood out whether he wanted to or not. Every question he asked felt like it carried extra weight. Every mistake seemed more visible. Every success had to be twice as good to be considered just good enough. He set his backpack down on one of the worn wooden benches and pulled out his notebook. It was filled with sketches and notes from late-night reading sessions. While other students were out on weekends, Daniel spent hours watching repair videos online and reading service manuals he'd downloaded. His roommate always joked that he was married to engines, but Daniel didn't mind. There was something peaceful about understanding how things worked, about seeing a problem and knowing you had the skills to fix it. The workshop door creaked open, and a few other students trickled in. They nodded at Daniel, some friendly, others barely acknowledging him. He nodded back and returned to his notebook. He was reviewing fuel injection systems, trying to memorize the pressure specifications for different engine types. Details mattered in this field, and Daniel knew he couldn't afford to be just okay. He had to be exceptional. Professor Reynolds arrived exactly at 8 o'clock, as he always did. The man was in his late 50s, with gray hair and the kind of weathered hands that came from decades of actually working on engines before teaching about them. He had a reputation. Some students loved him for his no-nonsense approach and deep knowledge. Others found him intimidating, even harsh. Daniel hadn't quite decided which camp he fell into yet. But today was different. Today, Professor Reynolds wasn't alone. He was pushing a large metal cart, and on top of it sat a diesel engine that looked like it had been through a war. It was covered in grease stains and had wires hanging off it at odd angles. "Gather around, everyone," Professor Reynolds called out, his voice carrying easily across the workshop. The students shuffled forward, forming a loose circle around the cart. Daniel stayed toward the back, watching carefully. "This," the professor said, patting the engine like it was an old friend, "is what we call a career maker, or a career breaker. This engine has been sitting in our department for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. It came from a trade school upstate, and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. Neither could we. Neither could the team from the manufacturer who came down here last month." A few students exchanged glances. One guy near the front let out a low whistle. Professor Reynolds continued. "All the diagnostics come back clean. Computer says everything's fine. Sensors read normal. Compression is good. Fuel system checks out. But it won't start. Or rather, it starts sometimes and then dies. No pattern, no consistency. It's made fools out of some very experienced technicians." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the engine. Even from where he stood, he could see it was a modern diesel, probably out of a commercial truck. The kind with all the emissions equipment and electronic controls that made them complicated to work on. But there was something else. Something in the way the intercooler hoses were positioned that caught his attention. The professor launched into his lecture about diagnostic procedures and systematic troubleshooting. Daniel listened, but part of his mind was still on that engine. He'd seen similar symptoms before, back when he was 15 and spending summers at his uncle's repair shop in Detroit. His uncle ran a small operation, fixing everything from lawnmowers to semi-trucks. The shop wasn't fancy, but his uncle had a gift. He could listen to an engine and know what was wrong, almost like he could hear what it was trying to say. Daniel remembered one particular truck that had stumped his uncle for days. It had the same issue. Would start fine sometimes, then refuse to run. All the computer diagnostics came back perfect. They'd replaced sensors, checked wiring, cleaned fuel injectors. Nothing worked. Then one evening, his uncle had stopped, sat down on an old milk crate and just stared at the engine for 20 minutes without saying a word. "What are you doing?" Daniel had asked. "Thinking about what we haven't checked," his uncle replied. "Sometimes the answer isn't in what's broken. It's in what we assumed was working fine." That night, they'd found a crushed air intake hose hidden behind other components, something that wouldn't show up on any diagnostic computer, but was choking the engine just enough to cause intermittent problems. "Mr. Williams, are you with us?" Daniel's head snapped up. Professor Reynolds was looking directly at him and not in a friendly way. The entire class had turned to stare. "Yes, sir," Daniel said, keeping his voice steady. "Then perhaps you'd like to share with the class what's so fascinating that you felt the need to zone out during my lecture." Heat crept up Daniel's neck, but he didn't look away. "I was looking at the engine, sir. Thinking about the symptoms you described." "Oh, you were thinking," Professor Reynolds said, and there was an edge to his voice now. A few students snickered. "And I suppose in your vast experience you've seen this problem before?" Daniel hesitated. He could feel the trap closing. If he said yes, he'd sound arrogant. If he said no, he'd look foolish for spacing out. Either way, he was going to come out looking bad. "I've seen similar issues," he said carefully. "Not exactly the same, but similar patterns." Professor Reynolds walked over to where Daniel stood. The workshop had gone completely quiet now. This wasn't normal lecture stuff anymore. This was something else, and everyone could feel it. "Similar patterns," the professor repeated. "Interesting. Tell me, Mr. Williams, what do you think is wrong with this engine?" "I don't know, sir. I'd need to examine it." "You'd need to examine it," Professor Reynolds said, nodding slowly. "This engine has been examined by certified master technicians, by engineers from the factory, by every senior student in this program. But you think you could just examine it and figure out what they all missed?" The challenge in his voice was clear now. This wasn't about the engine anymore. Daniel could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was happening. He'd seen it before in different forms. The assumption that he didn't belong here, that he was out of his depth, that his presence in this program was some kind of diversity checkbox rather than earned merit. Part of him wanted to back down, to apologize and sink back into invisibility. But another part, the part that had spent countless hours learning this trade, the part that had earned every bit of knowledge he had, refused to be dismissed. "I think everyone's been looking at it the same way," Daniel said, his voice quiet but firm. "Sometimes you need fresh eyes." Professor Reynolds stared at him for a long moment. Then unexpectedly he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, fresh eyes. "I like that. Tell you what, Mr. Williams, since you seem confident, let's make this interesting. Come up here and diagnose this engine. You've got 10 minutes. If you can even identify what's wrong, I'll give you extra credit for the semester. If you can't, well, maybe you'll learn something about humility." The workshop erupted in whispers. Daniel felt every eye in the room on him. This was it. This was the moment where he either proved himself or became a cautionary tale. He thought about his uncle, about all those hours in the shop, about every person who'd ever doubted whether he belonged in spaces like this. He took a breath and stepped forward. 10 minutes, he said. "I'll take that challenge." The walk from the back of the workshop to the front felt like it took forever, even though it was probably only 10 steps. Daniel could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Behind him, chairs scraped against the concrete floor as students shifted to get a better view. Someone had already pulled out their phone. Of course they had. This was either going to be impressive or embarrassing, and either way it would probably end up on social media before lunch. Professor Reynolds made a show of checking his watch. 10 minutes, Mr. Williams, starting now." Daniel stopped in front of the engine and forced himself to take a slow breath. Panic wouldn't help him here. Neither would rushing. He'd watched enough mechanics make mistakes by jumping to conclusions, by letting pressure push them into guessing instead of thinking. His uncle used to say that an engine would tell you everything you needed to know if you just paid attention. The trick was knowing what to look for. He started walking around the cart slowly, taking in the whole engine from different angles. It was a 6-cylinder diesel, probably from a medium-duty truck, the kind used for local deliveries or small construction work. Modern enough to have all the electronic fuel injection and emission controls, but not so new that it would be completely computerized. That was actually good. It meant there were still mechanical components that could fail in ways a computer might not catch. 8 minutes, Professor Reynolds announced. Someone in the class laughed nervously. Daniel ignored it. He was looking at the fuel lines now, tracing them with his eyes from the tank connection point through the filter and up to the injection pump. Everything looked intact. No visible leaks, no kinked hoses. The fuel filter housing wasn't cracked. That wasn't the problem. He moved to the air intake system. The air filter was new, probably replaced during one of the previous diagnostic attempts. The intake manifold looked clean. But something about the intercooler caught his attention. It was the same thing he'd noticed earlier during the lecture. The hoses connected to it seemed fine, but there was something about the way they sat that didn't look quite right. Daniel crouched down to get a better angle. The intercooler was a heat exchanger, basically. On turbocharged diesel engines like this one, it cooled the compressed air before it went into the cylinders. Cooler air was denser, which meant better combustion. If the intercooler wasn't working right, the engine could run poorly or not at all, but it wasn't something that typically failed in a way that made diagnostics difficult. 6 minutes. The professor's voice had an edge of satisfaction to it now. Daniel could imagine what the man was thinking. That this was going exactly as expected. That Daniel was in over his head and would slink back to his seat having learned his place. The thought made something in his chest tighten, but he pushed it down. He didn't have time for anger right now. He stood up and circled back to the other side of the engine. His mind was racing through possibilities. Intermittent starting issues with clean diagnostics. That ruled out most sensor failures. The computer would catch those. It also made major mechanical failures unlikely. A cracked cylinder head or blown head gasket would show up in compression tests. Bad injectors would leave traces in the fuel system. What could cause problems that came and went without leaving evidence? His uncle's voice came back to him. That truck with the crushed intake hose. The problem hadn't been that the hose was completely blocked. It was partially restricted, just enough to starve the engine of air under certain conditions, but not enough to be obvious during a static inspection. The symptoms had seemed random because they depended on engine load and ambient temperature. Daniel's eyes went back to the intercooler. What if something similar was happening here? Not a crushed hose, but something inside the intercooler itself. A blockage that wasn't complete, that might shift around or only cause problems under certain conditions. 4 minutes. Mr. Williams, hope you're getting close. There was definitely satisfaction in the professor's voice now. Other students were whispering to each other. Daniel heard someone say, "He's got nothing." This is brutal, but Daniel was barely listening anymore. He was thinking about how an intercooler could be partially blocked. These things were basically radiators for air. They had internal passages that the compressed air flowed through. What if something had gotten inside one of those passages? Something small enough that it wouldn't completely stop airflow but would restrict it. Something that might move around, making the restriction intermittent. It seemed unlikely. These were sealed units. But this engine had been worked on by multiple people. Maybe someone had taken the intercooler apart during a previous repair attempt. Maybe they'd been trying to clean it or check it, and something had gotten left inside. He needed to check, but he'd have to remove parts to do it. That would take time. "Professor," Daniel said, "I need to take off some components to check something." "You want to start taking apart an engine you've never touched before? With 3 minutes left?" Professor Reynolds shook his head. "This isn't a guess and check exercise, son. You said you could diagnose the problem." "I think I know what it is," Daniel said, keeping his voice level. "But I need to confirm it. I need to remove the intercooler outlet connection." 2.5 minutes. Daniel didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a socket wrench from the tool cart nearby and moved to the intercooler. His hands were steady now. The nervousness from earlier had burned away, replaced by focus. This was what he was good at. Not performing under pressure from a hostile professor, but understanding mechanical systems, finding problems. His fingers worked quickly, loosening the clamp on the large rubber hose that connected to the intercooler outlet. Behind him, the whispers had stopped. Everyone was watching now, genuinely curious to see what he was doing. Even Professor Reynolds had gone quiet, though Daniel could feel the man's skeptical gaze on his back. The hose came free with a soft pop. Daniel set it aside carefully and peered into the intercooler outlet. It was dark inside, hard to see much without a light, but even in the dim interior of the opening, he thought he could make out something. A shadow that didn't belong, a slight irregularity in the smooth passage. "I need a flashlight," he said. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the students, a guy named Chris who Daniel had worked with on a previous project, grabbed a work light from the bench and brought it over. "Here." "Thanks," Daniel said, taking the light. He angled it into the intercooler outlet and looked again. There. Definitely something in there. It looked like fabric maybe, dark and oil-soaked, wedged into the internal fins of the intercooler core, not blocking the passage completely but definitely restricting flow. And because it was soft material, it could shift around depending on air pressure and vibration, making the restriction intermittent. 1 minute, Mr. Williams." Daniel straightened up. His heart was pounding again. but this time with excitement rather than nervousness. He'd found it. Or at least he was pretty sure he had. But getting it out to prove it would take longer than 1 minute. He needed to explain what he'd found and hope that was enough. "There's a blockage in the intercooler," he said, turning to face the class and the professor. "There's something lodged in the internal passages. Looks like fabric, maybe part of a shop rag. It's not completely blocking airflow, which is why the engine sometimes runs okay. But when it shifts position or when the engine tries to pull hard and needs more air, the blockage restricts flow enough to cause problems. The computer doesn't see it because all the sensors are reading correctly. The air is still pressurized, still the right temperature. The computer doesn't know that the volume of air is reduced." Professor Reynolds walked over slowly. He didn't look satisfied anymore. He looked interested, maybe even impressed, though he was trying to hide it. "That's quite a theory, but you haven't actually shown me anything. For all I know, you're just guessing. Look for yourself," Daniel said, stepping aside and offering the flashlight. "You can see it in there if you angle the light right." The professor took the light, his expression skeptical. He bent down and peered into the intercooler outlet, adjusting the angle of the beam. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The workshop was completely silent now. Every student was leaning forward, trying to read the professor's reaction. Finally, Professor Reynolds straightened up. He looked at Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. Surprise, definitely. Maybe some embarrassment. Maybe even a hint of respect. "There is something in there," he said slowly. The workshop erupted. Students started talking all at once, some excited, some disbelieving. A few came forward to look for themselves. Professor Reynolds held up a hand for quiet, but it took a moment for everyone to settle down. Daniel stood there, his hands at his sides, waiting. He'd found the problem, or at least identified it, but he didn't know what came next. Would the professor acknowledge it? Or would he find some reason to dismiss it, to claim it didn't count because Daniel hadn't fully removed the blockage in the time limit? "Well," Professor Reynolds said finally, and there was something different in his voice now. The edge of hostility was gone. "It seems Mr. Williams has done what several teams of experienced technicians couldn't do. In less than 10 minutes. The way he said it wasn't quite an apology, but it wasn't dismissive either. It was acknowledgement, and coming from Professor Reynolds, that was something. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, so strong it almost made his knees weak. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. The workshop stayed noisy for another minute or so, with students talking over each other and several coming forward to peer into the intercooler themselves. Daniel stepped back, letting them look, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. He'd been so focused during those 10 minutes that he hadn't really felt the pressure. Now it hit him all at once. Chris clapped him on the shoulder. "Dude, that was incredible. How did you even think to check there?" Before Daniel could answer, Professor Reynolds spoke up again. "All right, settle down, everyone. Let's finish what we started here. Mr. Williams identified a potential problem, but we need to confirm it and understand exactly what we're dealing with. This is still a learning opportunity." He turned to Daniel. "You want to help me remove the intercooler completely so we can see what's actually in there?" It wasn't really a question, but Daniel nodded anyway. "Yes, sir." They spent the next 15 minutes carefully removing the intercooler from the engine. It was bolted in place with several brackets and had multiple hose connections that needed to be loosened. The other students watched, some taking notes as the professor and Daniel worked together. It was strange, working side by side with the man who'd basically tried to humiliate him 20 minutes earlier. But Professor Reynolds seemed different now, more focused on the engine and less on making a point. When they finally lifted the intercooler free and set it on the workbench, Professor Reynolds grabbed a trouble light and positioned it at one end. "Let's see what we've got." Daniel leaned in, along with half a dozen other students who'd crowded around. With proper lighting and a better angle, the blockage was much more visible. Wedged deep in the cooling fins was a piece of dark blue fabric about the size of a hand towel but wadded up. It was soaked with oil and grime, making it dark and hard to spot. The fabric had partially blocked several of the internal passages, creating exactly the kind of intermittent restriction Daniel had suspected. "Unbelievable," one of the students muttered. "That's been in there this whole time?" Professor Reynolds reached for a long set of picks and carefully began working the fabric loose. It took some effort. The material had been compressed into the fins and had gotten caught on the sharp edges. When he finally pulled it free, everyone could see it clearly. It was definitely part of a shop rag, the kind every automotive shop had by the hundreds. The professor held it up to the light, turning it over in his hands. This engine came from a technical school upstate. They'd been using it for student training for years. Someone must have been cleaning it or working on it and left this inside when they reassembled everything. It probably didn't cause problems right away. These things can take a while to work their way into the wrong spot. He set the rag down on the bench and looked at Daniel, really looked at him, not with skepticism or challenge, but with genuine curiosity. How did you know to look there? That's not a standard diagnostic step. Even experienced techs wouldn't automatically check inside an intercooler core. Daniel felt all the eyes in the room on him again. But this time it was different. People weren't waiting for him to fail. They were actually interested in what he had to say. I saw something similar when I was younger, he explained. I used to work at my uncle's repair shop during summers. He ran a small operation, fixed everything. One time we had a truck with symptoms like this engine. Would start fine sometimes, other times it wouldn't run at all. Drove my uncle crazy for days because all the diagnostics looked good. He paused, remembering those long days in the shop, the frustration on his uncle's face. My uncle finally figured out there was a crushed air intake hose hidden behind other components. It wasn't blocking airflow completely, just restricting it. The symptoms seemed random because they depended on how hard the engine was working and how the restriction was positioned. When I saw this engine today and heard you describe the symptoms, it reminded me of that truck. So you made an educated guess based on past experience, Professor Reynolds said. Sort of, Daniel agreed, but it was more than that. Everyone kept saying the diagnostics came back clean. Computer systems can only tell you about things they're designed to monitor. They can read sensors and check electrical systems, but they can't see physical blockages in places where there aren't sensors. I figured if all the electronic stuff checked out, the problem had to be mechanical and in a spot that wasn't being checked. One of the other students, a woman named Jessica who usually sat near the front, spoke up. But why the intercooler specifically? There are lots of places where something could be blocked. The symptoms, Daniel said. Intermittent starting problems with power loss. That suggested an air restriction rather than a fuel problem. Fuel system issues usually show up more consistently, and the intercooler made sense because it's one of the few components where a partial blockage could move around and cause variable restriction. Plus, if someone had worked on the engine before, the intercooler is something they might have removed to access other parts. Professor Reynolds was nodding slowly. That's solid reasoning. You worked backwards from symptoms to likely causes, then eliminated possibilities based on what had already been checked. That's exactly how you should approach complex diagnostics. He paused, then added, I owe you an apology, Mr. Williams. I challenged you today for the wrong reasons. I made assumptions about what you could contribute, and that was unfair. You've shown this entire class, myself included, something important today. The apology caught Daniel off guard. He hadn't expected that, especially not in front of everyone. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, the professor said, but there was a hint of a smile now. You still have to write up a full diagnostic report on this engine, explaining your methodology and conclusions. Due Monday. Consider it part of that extra credit I promised. A few students groaned at the mention of more work, but they were smiling. The tension that had filled the workshop earlier was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like excitement. This had turned into a real teaching moment, the kind that students would actually remember. Professor Reynolds addressed the whole class. Here's what I want everyone to take away from this. Daniel didn't have any special tools or information that the rest of us didn't have. He looked at the same engine that stumped factory technicians and certified mechanics. What he had was a different perspective and the willingness to think beyond standard procedures. He picked up the oil-stained rag again. This is going to become a teaching tool. I'm going to keep it in my office as a reminder that sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one, even when you're dealing with complex modern systems. And that experience and intuition are just as important as diagnostic computers. The rest of the class period was spent discussing diagnostic methodology and systematic troubleshooting. But the dynamic had shifted. Students who'd barely spoken to Daniel before were asking him questions, wanting to know more about his experience at his uncle's shop. The professor called on him several times for input, treating his observations with the same respect he gave to any other student. When class ended, Daniel was packing up his notebook when Jessica approached him. That was really impressive. I've been in this program for 2 years, and I don't think I would have thought to check the intercooler. Thanks, Daniel said. Honestly, I wasn't sure I was right until we actually pulled it apart. I was kind of terrified I was wrong and would look stupid. But you weren't wrong, she pointed out. You trusted your knowledge and experience even when it was really high pressure. That takes guts. After she left, Chris came over. Man, you have to tell me more about that shop you worked at. Sounds like you learned a ton of practical stuff there. Yeah, my uncle's a great teacher, Daniel said. Different from classroom learning, but just as valuable. Maybe more valuable sometimes because you see all the weird problems that don't show up in textbooks. As students filed out, Daniel noticed Professor Reynolds was still at the workbench, making notes about the engine. Daniel hesitated, then walked over. Professor, can I ask you something? The older man looked up. Of course. Why did you challenge me like that? In front of everyone? Professor Reynolds sighed and set down his pen. That's a fair question. Honestly, I was frustrated. This engine has been making me look foolish for weeks, and when you seemed distracted during my lecture, I saw an opportunity to redirect some of that frustration. That was wrong of me. I used you to make a point, and that's not what good teaching looks like. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm going to be straight with you. I've been teaching for 30 years, and I've developed blind spots. I made assumptions about you today based on things that had nothing to do with your actual abilities. That's on me, not you. What you showed today is that you've got real talent and instincts for this work. I should have recognized that earlier. Daniel didn't know what to say. The apology felt genuine, which made it both better and somehow harder to hear. I appreciate that, sir. I'd like you to consider something, Professor Reynolds continued. We have an advanced diagnostics lab that runs in the afternoons. Small group of students working on complex problems, unusual cases. I think you'd be a good fit for it. Interested? Really? Daniel tried not to sound too surprised. Yeah, I'd definitely be interested. Good. Come by my office next week and we'll get you set up. The professor extended his hand, and Daniel shook it. And Mr. Williams? Keep trusting those instincts of yours. They're clearly good ones. Walking out of the workshop, Daniel felt like something fundamental had shifted, not just in how the professor saw him, but in how he saw himself. By lunchtime, Daniel knew that word had gotten out. He could tell by the way people looked at him in the cafeteria. Not hostile looks or suspicious ones, but curious glances. A few students he'd never spoken to actually nodded at him as he walked past with his tray. One guy even gave him a thumbs up. His roommate, Kevin, was already at their usual table near the windows. Kevin was in the welding program, built like he could bench press a car, but one of the most easygoing people Daniel had ever met. He grinned as Daniel sat down. So I heard you embarrassed Professor Reynolds this morning, Kevin said, biting into his sandwich. Please tell me someone got it on video. I didn't embarrass him, Daniel said, though he couldn't help smiling. I just figured out what was wrong with an engine. Dude, according to the 3 different people who told me about it, you solved a problem in 10 minutes, that professional. Mechanics couldn't solve in weeks. That's not just figuring something out. That's showing off. Daniel shook his head, but he was still smiling. It wasn't like that. I got lucky, honestly. I'd seen something similar before. Yeah, a modest hero routine. I get it. Kevin took another bite of his sandwich, then his expression got more serious. For real, though, I heard Reynolds called you out pretty hard in front of everyone. That had to be rough. It wasn't great, Daniel admitted, but it worked out. Still, that took guts, walking up there knowing everyone was watching and expecting you to fail. Kevin paused. You know, people talk, right? About how you're always early to class, always studying. Some people think you're trying too hard, like you're showing off or something. Daniel had heard variations of this before. He set down his fork and looked at his friend. I'm not trying too hard. I'm trying exactly as hard as I need to. There's a difference. I know that, Kevin said quickly. I'm just saying what I've heard. And after today, maybe people will get it. You're not showing off. You just actually know your stuff. Before Daniel could respond, Jessica from his automotive class appeared at their table. Hey, sorry to interrupt. Daniel, can I ask you something? Sure, what's up? She glanced at Kevin, then back to Daniel. A bunch of us are getting together this weekend to work on a project car. It's this old pickup truck that won't run right, and we've been trying to figure it out for a month. Would you want to come take a look? No pressure if you're busy. Daniel was surprised by the invitation. Jessica was part of a study group that he'd never quite felt welcome in before. They were all good students, serious about the program, but they'd always seemed like a closed circle. Yeah, I could do that. Where and when? Saturday afternoon at the community garage off campus. Around 2? She pulled out her phone. Give me your number and I'll text you the address. After she left, Kevin raised his eyebrows. See, you're already famous. Next thing you know, you'll be too cool to hang out with us normal people. Shut up, Daniel said, laughing. But inside he felt something warming. Maybe this was what it felt like to actually belong somewhere. The rest of the week was strange. Good strange mostly, but still an adjustment. In his classes, instructors who'd barely acknowledged him before were suddenly calling on him more, asking his opinion on technical problems. Other students were friendlier, more likely to include him in conversations or ask if he wanted to study together, but it wasn't all positive. Daniel overheard a conversation in the hallway on Thursday that reminded him that not everyone was happy about what had happened. I'm just saying, it's convenient, someone was saying. Daniel recognized the voice as belonging to Tyler, a student who'd been in his freshman classes. Like, that engine stumped everyone, including the professor. But this one guy walks up and solves it in 10 minutes? Seems staged to me. Why would they stage something like that? Another voice asked. Come on, use your head. The department's been under pressure to show more diversity. What better way than to make one of their minority students look like a genius? I bet Reynolds knew what was wrong the whole time and set it up so the kid could find it. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this was coming. It always did. When things went well, there was always someone ready to explain it away, to suggest it was luck or help or some kind of setup. Never just that he was good at what he did. He turned the corner, walking directly past Tyler and his friend. Tyler's face went red when he realized Daniel had heard them. Daniel didn't say anything, just kept walking. What was there to say? He couldn't control what people thought. He could only keep doing the work and hope that eventually, his results would speak louder than the doubters. That afternoon, he went to Professor Reynolds' office for the first time. The door was open, and the professor waved him in when he knocked. The office was exactly what Daniel would have expected. Shelves full of technical manuals, a desk covered in papers and engine parts, posters of classic cars on the walls. On the bookshelf behind the desk, Daniel could see the oil-stained rag from the intercooler, now cleaned and mounted in a small frame with a label beneath it. Have a seat, Professor Reynolds said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. I wanted to talk to you about the advanced diagnostics lab I mentioned. He pulled out a folder and opened it. It meets Tuesday and Thursday afternoons from 3 to 5. Small group, usually 6 to 8 students. We work on real problems brought in by local shops and dealerships. Stuff that stumped the regular mechanics. Sometimes we solve them, sometimes we don't, but it's good experience either way. That sounds great, Daniel said. When can I start? Next Tuesday if you want. But there's something else I wanted to discuss. The professor leaned back in his chair. What happened on Monday has gotten attention. The department head heard about it. So did a few people at some of the local shops we work with. One of them, a guy who runs a diesel repair operation, specifically asked if you'd be interested in an internship. Daniel felt his heart skip. An internship? Seriously? Serious as a heart attack. It's a good shop. They do commercial truck work mostly. The owner, his name is Mr. Patterson. He's been in the business 40 years. He said he's impressed by what he heard about your diagnostic work, and he wants young mechanics who can think outside the box. The pay's not amazing, but it's real work experience. And Patterson's the kind of guy who actually teaches his people instead of just using them for grunt work. I'd definitely be interested, Daniel said, trying not to sound too eager even though his mind was racing. An internship at a real shop, working on actual customer vehicles, getting paid to learn. This was exactly what he'd hoped for, but hadn't expected to find until after graduation. I'll give Patterson your email, Professor Reynolds said. He'll reach out next week to set up an interview. Just so you know, he's tough but fair. He expects a lot from his people, but he rewards hard work. That's perfect. Thank you, sir. For the recommendation and for the lab opportunity, the professor waved it off. You earned both of those. I'm just connecting dots. He paused, his expression becoming more serious. How are things going otherwise? I know Monday put you in a spotlight you probably weren't expecting. Daniel thought about lying, about saying everything was fine. But something about the professor's tone made him tell the truth. Most people have been great. But I heard some students saying the whole thing was staged, that you set it up to make me look good. Professor Reynolds' jaw tightened. Who said that? It doesn't matter. People are going to think what they want to think. It matters to me, the professor said firmly. What you did on Monday was legitimate. You found a problem that experienced professionals missed. Nobody helped you, nobody gave you hints. You used your knowledge and experience to solve a real diagnostic challenge. Anyone who suggests otherwise is wrong. And if I hear anyone in my classes spreading that kind of nonsense, I'll address it directly. I appreciate that, Daniel said. But you can't control what people say in the hallways or online. I've dealt with this kind of thing before. The best thing I can do is keep working and let my results speak for themselves. The professor studied him for a moment. You're probably right, but it still bothers me that you have to deal with it at all. For what it's worth, I've been teaching long enough to recognize real talent when I see it. You've got it. Don't let anyone make you doubt that. Walking back to his dorm later, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Hey, this is Tony. I'm in your Wednesday lab section. A few of us are stuck on this transmission problem for our project. Any chance you could take a look tomorrow? Daniel smiled and typed back a response. Yeah, he could help. Saturday came and Daniel found himself at the community garage with Jessica and 5 other students from the program. The garage was a nonprofit space where students could rent bay time to work on their own vehicles. The truck they'd been working on was a late 90s Ford, and according to Jessica, it had been giving them trouble for weeks. It starts fine when it's cold, she explained as they all stood around the truck. But once it warms up, it starts running rough and eventually stalls. We've replaced the fuel pump, checked all the sensors, cleaned the throttle body, everything we can think of. Daniel popped the hood and started looking around, asking questions about what they'd already tried and what the symptoms were exactly. The other students watched, some skeptical, some curious. He could feel the pressure again, that sense of needing to prove himself. But he tried to push it aside and focus on the truck. After about 20 minutes of inspection and testing, he found it. A small vacuum leak in a hose that only opened up when the engine was hot and the rubber expanded. Simple problem, easy fix, but hard to spot because it didn't show up during cold starts when most testing happened. You're kidding, one of the guys said when Daniel showed them the split hose. We've been fighting with this thing for a month and it's a $20 hose. Sometimes it's the simple stuff, Daniel said, echoing something his uncle used to tell him. They replaced the hose, started the truck, and let it warm up. It ran smooth as silk. Jessica actually hugged him, which made him blush. The other students were impressed, grateful, and Daniel could feel himself being accepted into the group in a way he hadn't been before. On the drive back to campus, squeezed into the back of someone's car with 3 other students, listening to them joke and argue about their next project, Daniel realized something. This was what he'd wanted all along. Not fame or recognition, but just to be part of the community, to be valued for what he knew and could contribute, to belong. 3 weeks after the incident with the engine, Daniel sat in the advanced diagnostics lab working on a problem that had him genuinely stumped. It was a hybrid vehicle with an intermittent electrical fault that nobody could track down. He'd been at it for over an hour, and he was starting to understand how those factory technicians must have felt with the intercooler problem. Taking a break might help, Professor Reynolds said, walking over to where Daniel was hunched over a wiring diagram. Sometimes when you're too close to a problem, you stop seeing clearly. Yeah, you're probably right, Daniel admitted, sitting back and rubbing his eyes. I keep thinking I'm missing something obvious, but I can't figure out what. Welcome to the reality of diagnostic work, the professor said with a slight smile. Not every problem gets solved in 10 minutes. Some of them take days or weeks. Some you never fully solve, you just find a workaround. The lab had turned out to be everything Daniel hoped it would be. The small group of students tackled real problems from local shops, and while Daniel had helped solve a few of them, he'd also learned a lot from watching other students work. There was a woman named Rachel who was brilliant with electrical systems, and a guy called Ben who could diagnose transmission problems by sound alone. Everyone brought different strengths to the table. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Patterson at the diesel shop. Can you come in tomorrow morning instead of afternoon? Got a rush job that could use your eyes on it. Daniel smiled and texted back confirmation. The internship had started 2 weeks ago, and it was challenging in the best possible way. Patterson ran a tight operation, and he expected his people to work hard and think critically. But he also taught constantly, explaining not just what to do but why. Daniel was learning more in a few weeks at the shop than he had in some of his full semester courses. Good news? Professor Reynolds asked, noticing Daniel's expression. Just Patterson asking if I can come in earlier tomorrow. There's a rush job. He's working you hard, I take it? Very hard, Daniel said. But I love it. It's exactly what I wanted. The professor nodded approvingly. Patterson doesn't ask people to come in early unless he values their input. That's high praise from him. Later that evening, Daniel was in his dorm room studying when Kevin burst in, clearly excited about something. Dude, you will not believe what just happened in my welding class. Daniel looked up from his textbook. What? So we had this visiting instructor come in, right? Guy who works for some big manufacturing company. He's showing us this complex welding technique. And he's going on about how you have to do it exactly this way. No variation, it's the only method that works. And this one student, this quiet guy who never says much, he raises his hand and suggests a different approach. Kevin sat down on his bed, still animated. The instructor gets all dismissive, like, I've been doing this 20 years, kid. I think I know what I'm talking about. But the student, he's polite, but he sticks to his point. Says he learned a different technique at his old job, and it actually works better for certain materials. Let me guess, Daniel said, starting to smile. The instructor challenged him to prove it? Exactly. Had him come up in front of everyone, gave him 15 minutes to show what he was talking about. And the kid, he does it. His method worked better, cleaner welds, less heat distortion. The instructor had to admit it in front of the whole class. Kevin leaned back against the wall. Everyone in the welding program is talking about it. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is exactly what happened to you with that engine. Someone in authority makes assumptions, challenges a student to prove themselves, and the student comes through. It's not quite the same, Daniel said, but he understood what Kevin was getting at, though I'm glad it worked out for that guy. The thing is, Kevin continued, I started thinking about how often this probably happens. How many students have good ideas or knowledge or experience that doesn't get heard because they don't fit what people expect? How many times do instructors or bosses shut down input from people they've already decided aren't worth listening to? Daniel set down his textbook. He'd been thinking about similar things over the past few weeks. I don't think it's always intentional. People develop patterns, you know? They get used to certain students being strong in certain areas, and they stop looking for surprises. It takes something dramatic like what happened with me or with that welding student to break the pattern. Maybe, Kevin said, but it shouldn't take something dramatic. People should just listen in the first place. True, but the world doesn't always work the way it should. A few days later, Daniel was working at Patterson's shop when something happened that reminded him of that conversation. One of the other mechanics, a guy in his 40s named Rick, was struggling with a truck that wouldn't regen properly. The diesel particulate filter kept getting clogged, and Rick had already spent half the day trying to figure out why. Daniel was working on a different vehicle nearby, but he'd been half listening to Rick mutter and curse at the truck. Finally, during his break, Daniel walked over. Mind if I take a look? Rick straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. Be my guest. I'm about ready to push this thing off a cliff. Daniel spent a few minutes looking at the exhaust system and checking the service records on the computer. When's the last time someone checked the diesel fuel quality? Fuel quality? Why would that matter for a DPF problem? If the fuel has high sulfur content or certain contaminants, it can cause excessive soot production, Daniel explained. The DPF clogs faster than it can regen. It's not common with modern low-sulfur diesel. But if this truck has been fueled at an older station or somewhere with questionable fuel quality, it could cause exactly these symptoms. Rick looked skeptical. I've been working on diesels for 20 years, kid. Never seen fuel quality cause a problem like this. Just an idea, Daniel said, backing off. He wasn't going to push it. He'd learned that some people didn't like suggestions from younger mechanics, especially when they'd been stuck on a problem for a while. But Patterson, who'd been working at his desk in the corner of the shop, had overheard. Check it anyway, Rick. Can't hurt, and the kid might be onto something. Rick didn't look happy about it, but he pulled a fuel sample and tested it. 10 minutes later, he was staring at the test results with a mixture of surprise and frustration. High sulfur content. Significantly higher than it should be. How did you know to check that? Read about it in a service bulletin once, Daniel said. Stuck in my memory because it seemed like such an unusual cause for a common problem. Patterson walked over and looked at the results. Good catch, Daniel. Rick, find out where this truck's been fueling and let the customer know they need to change stations. And give the kids some credit. Good diagnostic work is good diagnostic work, doesn't matter how old you are. Rick nodded, though he still looked a bit embarrassed. Yeah, good call, thanks. After Rick walked away, Patterson pulled Daniel aside. You handled that well. You suggested the idea without making Rick feel stupid. And you backed off when he was resistant. That's important when you're working with people who have more experience. You can be right and still be respectful about it. I'm still learning how to navigate that, Daniel admitted. Sometimes I don't know if I should speak up or stay quiet. Here's what I tell all my young mechanics, Patterson said. If you have an idea that might solve the problem, speak up. But do it respectfully and be ready to back up your reasoning. Most experienced mechanics will listen if you approach them right. The ones who won't listen no matter what, well, that's their problem, not yours. A month after the original engine incident, Professor Reynolds asked Daniel to stay after class. I have something to show you, he said, leading Daniel to the front of the workshop. The diesel engine that had started everything was back on its stand, but it looked different now. It had been completely cleaned and reassembled, and next to it was a new display case. Inside the case was the oil-stained rag from the intercooler, along with a detailed write-up of the diagnostic process. We're making this a permanent teaching exhibit, Professor Reynolds explained. Every new student in the program will hear this story as part of their introduction to diagnostic methodology. It's a perfect example of thinking beyond standard procedures and trusting your instincts. Daniel read the description plaque. It told the story of the engine problem, but more importantly, it talked about the importance of diverse perspectives in problem solving and the danger of making assumptions about who can contribute valuable insights. Your name's on there, the professor pointed out. Hope that's okay. Wanted to give credit where it's due. It's more than okay, Daniel said quietly. Thank you, Professor Reynolds countered. You taught me something important that day. I'd gotten comfortable in my assumptions, stopped questioning my own biases. You shook that up. Made me a better teacher.